Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In drafting this amendment and the other amendments that I will offer, I will not ask for a vote on all of them, but I approached it in this manner, trying to make the least possible change to H.R. 3 to satisfy and address a shortcoming, and ensuring that any amendment that was offered did not disrupt the rest of the bill or substantially affect its score. The first of these amendments concerns some folks that I believe have been left out of this bill with no direct relief, and that's the many Americans who are uninsured. There's every indication that that number will increase. A report earlier this month showed the first increase in a generation among children of an increase. Today, those individuals who are uninsured, when they go to the pharmacy counter and are at the cash register, they indicate they have no insurance. They are likely to face the highest prices, the manufacturer's list price. It's a kind of upside-down reality where those who have the least are being forced to pay the most. While the Congressional Budget Office believes that some benefits will eventually...
Doggett, would you suspend for a second? We're not
Sure.
quite sure what amendment.
I'm sorry, there's only one there, I believe, on the uninsured.
That's not the one I have in front of me.
Okay, let's see what you got.
Mr. Doggett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When a person who is uninsured goes to the pharmacy counter and faces the cash register and says they have no insurance, they're likely to face the highest prices. H.R. 3 provides indirect benefit, according to the Congressional Budget Office, with some of the benefits that it has perhaps trickling down with lower prices in some areas, but as was acknowledged by our staff member, any benefit is not direct. And all that this amendment does is to add the uninsured into the definition of a fair price eligible individual to ensure that the uninsured can access the negotiated price, just like now people on ERISA with large employer plans under the amendment that was approved in the Ed and Labor Committee, and just like people on Medicare. We heard a lot about insulin today. In fact, Mr. Kildee referred to 3 people that died from rationing their insulin this past year. And they have a common denominator, and that is they either lacked insurance or they lacked adequate insurance. Megan Carter, who lost her job and her insurance and couldn't afford the $800 a month for insulin, took a cheaper but more unpredictable form, and on Christmas Day she lost her life. The same for Micah Fisher, and the same with a high deductible plan for Alex Smith. These are only a few of many tragedies, and the problem goes beyond insulin. In a March 2019 report, the CDC found that about 1/3 of uninsured U.S. adults did not make their medication as prescribed because of high prescription drug costs. My amendment would just include the uninsured among those who can benefit from, who can purchase their medications at whatever price is negotiated and publicized. As we work to deliver our promise to lower drug prices for all Americans, let's not forget the uninsured at a time when there are a growing number. I urge adoption of the amendment.
Recognize the gentleman from California. Does he?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw.
Mr. Thompson has withdrawn his amendment. On the amendment? Let me speak on the amendment. I think that coverage is better than discounts. Democrats have long supported expanding coverage to the uninsured so that patients can get access to health care services like drugs and doctor's visits when they need it. And this is what underpinned the Affordable Care Act. I want to be able to focus on getting Americans covered, reducing the number of uninsured, and getting people comprehensive coverage from doctor's visits to hospitalizations to prescription drugs. I do not support this amendment.
I move adoption of the amendment.
Mr. Doggett is
coverage eventually, but this benefit now. Thank you.
Do you want to vote on it right now, Lloyd?
Just oral vote?
Yeah. The gentleman has requested a recorded vote.
No. That's fine.
Do you want a recorded vote? It's up to you.
I'm ready to take an oral vote. That's fine.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
Mr. Chairman, just so you know, we will ask for a recorded vote.
That's fine.
Okay. So, the question before us is Mr. Brady has asked for a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Lewis.
No.
Mr. Lewis votes no. Mr. Doggett.
Aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
No.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
No.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kine. Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
For them.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy. Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes no. Mr. Brady.
Mr. Chairman, this seems so disorganized and short term. I don't understand what's happening here with Mr. Doggett. I'm going to vote present.
Mr. Brady votes present. Mr. Nunes. Mr. Nunes votes present. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan votes present. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Present.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes present. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant votes present. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed votes present. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes present. Mr. Holding. Mr. Holding votes present. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. Smith of Missouri votes present. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice votes present. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert votes present. Ms. Walorski. Ms. Walorski votes present. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood votes present. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup votes present. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes present. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson votes present. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes present. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Chairman votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Clerk prepared to report the tally.
Four yeas, 20 nays, 17 present.
4 yeas,
20 nays,
20 nays,
17 members present.
17 present, 17 members present. The amendment fails.